Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 26 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They've gone the Vegas Golden Knights and lost by a score of 4-3. This was the second matchup this season between these two teams. The first one took place Game 1 of the entire year. That was a game in which the Sharks actually held a lead heading into the third period, but would unfortunately end up giving up not just the game-tying goal due to a goaltending error / unfortunate bounce, but also the overtime game winner in a very similar fashion. And so that ended up turning what looked like it was going to be the Sharks' first win of the season into instead their first loss. And this really seemed to kind of just completely take the wind out of the Sharks' sails. They came in with a good amount of momentum and excitement for how this season could go after back-to-back last place finishes in the two previous years, and a game in which they probably felt as though they deserved a better outcome ended up being a loss, and you can kind of say that it was a little bit out of their control. And so this ended up just being the beginning of what would end up being a season opening 6-game losing streak. Now, since then, the Sharks have managed to kind of dig themselves out of that hole. They've had a very successful November that does come to an end with this matchup here tonight against Vegas, but obviously going head-to-head against the team that derailed their season back at the beginning, looking for some revenge. And so I was expecting that the Sharks, despite being on the road here, would come out with a really solid performance. And while this was far from being terrible, I don't think the Sharks were nearly as bad as, let's say, a few nights ago against the Colorado Avalanche. They were not the better team here. I do think the Vegas Golden Knights, unlike Game 1 of the season, did deserve the victory here tonight. The Sharks end up getting outplayed for large stretches of time, the large parts of the first period, large parts of the second period as well, and so they are unable to actually get these 2 points. Now, this one starts out in the first period with a goal from Will Smith, so after coming off the schneid in the one yesterday against the Vancouver Canucks, he does continue to put the puck in the net. That gives the Sharks the 1-0 lead, but then former San Jose Shark Tomas Hertl ties this game up at 1, and that is the score heading into the second period. In that second period, the Golden Knights blow the game wide open. They score 3 straight, give themselves the 4-1 lead, and it looks like at this point, San Jose might not really have it in them to actually compete in this one. On the road, pretty poor start to the game, but they managed to actually make it very interesting. They get a goal on the power play from Will Smith, his second of the night, and then it is Willie Mecklin in the dying seconds of the second period to bring the Sharks to within 1. And so now San Jose ended up finding themselves in the same position that the Golden Knights did back in that first matchup. They trail by 1 goal heading into the third period. Unfortunately for the Sharks, they don't have the same type of luck that Vegas did in that first matchup. They don't get the good bounce that just so happens to get past the goalie, and without that, they are really kind of unable to generate all that much offense. If you actually go back to the Sharks' most recent homestand, where they were rather successful, a 3-1 record in those 4 games, you look at those 3 wins against Utah, against Los Angeles, and against Boston, the Sharks held third period leads in all 3 of those games, sometimes multi-goal leads, and yet they would give up goals in those third periods. Against Utah, 2 of them that would force overtime. Against Los Angeles, 1 of them that would force overtime. And against Boston, while they did close out the regulation victory, they did give up a goal to make it pretty interesting. In all of those situations, it was the Sharks who were kind of forced on their heels, forced to defend, and the other team pushing and pushing, trying to get those game-tying goals. Here tonight, the shoe was on the other foot. It was the Sharks who had the chance to do the same thing to Vegas, but they were kind of just stopped in their tracks completely. They couldn't get much generated, and this goes back to what has been a kind of root issue for the San Jose Sharks, even through this month of November, where they have had a lot of success, where they have had a lot of victories. This is not a team that is consistently able to generate even just shot attempts, never mind scoring chances, when it comes to 5-on-5 play. And that was very much on display in this third period. It was really only in the last few minutes of this third where the Sharks finally actually started to get something going in the offensive zone. Nothing hugely serious, at least not until they pulled the goaltender and got a power play for themselves, that they actually had a couple of close calls. Otherwise, Vegas closed this game out rather well, and the Sharks didn't actually have many close calls to tie this one up at 4, and so they do end up losing it in regulation, leaving Vegas with 0 points. Certainly not what they were looking for. When it comes to the players to talk about, we do still have the same exact 12 forward group here for the San Jose Sharks. As I have mentioned time and time again, San Jose currently has 9 defensemen up in the NHL, and so there is not room to get a 13th forward here. So I don't think anything on this front is going to actually change until somebody comes back from injury, whether that be Jeff Skinner or Michael Misa. But as well, on top of the fact that all 12 of these forwards remain in the lineup, the actual lines do not change either, which isn't a huge surprise after the success that the Sharks had in yesterday's game against Vancouver. And so the top line remains Celebrini with Smith and Tyler Toffoli. I'll start off with Celebrini. Now, he does hit a pretty major accomplishment here for this game. He picks up the primary assist on this second Will Smith goal on the power play. Not really the cleanest one. I think it just happens to deflect off of his stick as it goes straight to Smith in front for that goal for himself, but this does mark his 100th point of his NHL career, coming in, I believe, 96 games, so just barely over a point per game pace. But what really makes this very exciting is that he ends up becoming the 8th youngest player in NHL history to actually hit the 100-point mark. He is in fantastic company amongst some really, really great NHL players for sure, and so congratulations to him. But looking past that, this was a game in which he certainly was not at his best. It felt as though there was maybe like a couple of decent puck touches that he had in this game, some couple of rushes up the ice to create some opportunities. One where he had like a really nice pass for Will Smith, who came pretty close to actually scoring, which I guess would have been kind of a hat trick, though I think it came before his second goal on the power play there. But generally, you kind of expect a little bit more from Celebrini. It didn't feel as though he quite had that in this game, and so I won't say it was disappointing. I do still think Celebrini was definitely one of the Sharks' better forwards here tonight, but we have seen a much higher level of play at times this season from him. When it comes to his 2 line mates, Will Smith, I talked about the confidence that it can give to a player when they actually manage to score a goal. We saw that last game against Vancouver just yesterday, where I thought it ended up leading to a very effective game against the Canucks, and it carried into tonight as well. I thought Will Smith was perhaps the Sharks' best player, and that's not just because he manages to grab these 2 goals, but he just definitely looked a lot more engaged than he has over these last couple of weeks, which was very, very nice to see. And so I was impressed with what Smith was able to do. And then when finally it comes to Tyler Toffoli, again, he is managing to make like small, slight impacts on this line. Like, he is decent in the defensive zone, as I have talked about. He has seen slight improvements in that area, and he does have some pretty good passes at times. He had a nice stretch pass there to Will Smith for that first goal. But what ultimately it comes down to for Tyler Toffoli is that he is a goal scorer. I have mentioned this many, many times, and he is now on, I believe, a 12-game goal scoring drought. Has not put the puck in the net for weeks at this point, and they mentioned it on the broadcast. His career longest drought came with the Los Angeles Kings, I believe, 6 years ago, and that was a 16-game stretch without a goal. He is now 3/4 of the way towards that, and the problem here is, as I've mentioned multiple times already, this is not really a case where Tyler Toffoli is completely snake bitten, where he's getting so many chances. This is the case where Tyler Toffoli just isn't really finding himself all that frequently in great scoring positions anymore. And so this 16-game record of his of a goal drought is certainly in jeopardy of getting broken, because it's hard to really foresee him actually putting the puck in the net outside of maybe like a fortunate bounce, which, funnily enough, is how he got his last goal as well. Now, there were a couple of more moments, I would say, that were exciting, I guess you could say, for him in this game. For instance, right near the end, with the goaltender pulled on that power play, the last few seconds, he gets a very good chance in front. And last season, you probably see Tyler Toffoli bury it from that situation. But it is not just him getting himself into not nearly as frequently the good scoring positions. I have talked about multiple times already how the dramatic drop-off there has been in his individual scoring chances at 5-on-5 and his individual high-danger chances. But even when he does rarely get himself into these spots, he just does not have anywhere close to the same amount of finish that he has, not just last year, but throughout much of his entire career. And so we have talked about so many times how there is something very obviously wrong with Tyler Toffoli. That continues here moving forward, and it's a problem for sure for the San Jose Sharks when he is a player that is paid quite handsomely here to actually score some goals. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Eklund, Wenberg, and Gaudette. This was a second line that was put together yesterday against the Vancouver Canucks, and it was actually rather successful, and I was not quite ready to kind of celebrate this trio of players because, no offense to the Vancouver Canucks, but they are not the greatest team. They are a team that is like the San Jose Sharks, where they are usually outchanced and outpossessed and things of that nature. And so it was a greater test here tonight against Vegas. Now, to be fair, Vegas hasn't had a ton of success this season. They've been more of a middle-of-the-pack squad, but certainly above the Vancouver Canucks. And so I was waiting to see what we would see from this second line, and it was actually some pretty good returns still. Nothing outstanding, but managed to get a few shifts in the defensive zone. I thought particularly that William Eklund has shown, again, a bit of a pickup in his game, which was absolutely necessary for the Sharks to actually see from this player, considering he is their third best offensive player. And then I was also very impressed with Adam Gaudette in this game as well, just generally being strong energy, decent shot attempts, not like an amazing game from him, but he has fit in pretty well into this group, I would say. Alex Wennberg, I thought, also had a few standout offensive moments. Again, it goes back to something that I mentioned before, which is like he can get 80 to 90% of the way there, but doesn't quite have the ability to actually complete these things, which is why I don't necessarily view him as an optimal second line center. But I thought this second line did come together reasonably well here tonight and did manage to execute a good play to actually get the goal that makes it 4-3 for Vegas to give the Sharks that hope heading into the third period. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Kurashev with Dellandrea and Colin Graf. Now, I mentioned how this was a third line that didn't really do much of anything at even strength last game for the San Jose Sharks, besides some pretty good defensive plays from guys like Graf and Dellandrea. From an offensive perspective, they had nothing doing. The good news is that offensively, they did actually have a couple of pretty good shifts in the offensive zone. There was one in the first period that I really liked what we were seeing from Graf and Dellandrea. They even had a 2-on-1 rush at a point as well, where Dellandrea took a shot, though he didn't end up scoring. So there were some positives coming out here, but at the same time, it did feel as though they were defending more often than not, and perhaps this is by design for Ryan Warsofsky. Perhaps he's tossing them on for more of these types of defensive situations. I remember last game that Colin Graf, was frequently on the ice against a player like Quinn Hughes, although Hughes was pretty much on the ice for half the game, and so that's kind of inevitably going to happen, but still using Colin Graf in more of that defensive position because he is more of that defensive player. But you would still like to see a little bit more time. Now, from an individual standpoint, Kurashev had been completely invisible yesterday against the Vancouver Canucks, and the good news is that I do think he had 2 or 3 pretty good shifts in this game, but you still want to see more from Kurashev. We also saw a pretty bad play on the Mitch Marner goal for the Vegas Golden Knights, where Kurashev does not make enough of an effort to actually get back. He could have been someone who blocks this wraparound attempt from Marner, but instead he's just kind of lazily skating back. That wasn't a particularly good look from him. And then the third line was also on the ice, getting a bit confused in their coverage when it came to the Tomas Hertl goal as well. So that wasn't necessarily a great look either. And so while this third line did have some more positives, it is still one that you're maybe waiting for a little bit more from. When it comes from a penalty killing perspective, which is usually where, of course, Dellandrea and Graf do stand out, the Sharks do actually end up giving up a power play goal here tonight. That one comes to Tomas Hertl. This isn't the usual type of power play goal that the Sharks have given up this season. Usually it is on these kind of cross ice passes, either down low or right through the middle. And so that was something that you just had to eliminate from a Sharks perspective because your goaltender has a very difficult time making that save. This was different because this is a shot from the point from Mitch Marner that ends up getting deflected in by Tomas Hertl. Now, nobody really makes much of an effort to block this shot. It's not the end of the world because there's not much traffic in front, so Nedeljkovic can actually see this puck, but the problem is that nobody actually ties up Tomas Hertl's stick, and so what this ended up actually just being is a shot from the point that Hertl has a very clean look at to try and tip. It's basically as though they were practicing this, in practice before tonight's game, because no real effort is actually made. It was very passive in this type of situation, which was a little bit disappointing to see from both Colin Graf and Ty Dellandrea, who were on the ice in that situation. I really feel as though they didn't expect Marner to take that shot, and that ends up burning the Sharks because that would be the eventual game winner. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, Goodrow, Ostapchuk, and Reeves, honestly, not much happened with this fourth line when they were on the ice. I think the most notable thing was Ryan Reeves completely running over, I believe it was Zach Whitecloud, with a huge hit. Otherwise, it felt as though when they were on the ice, nothing was happening. Now, that would be a huge negative for the first, the second, or even kind of the third line for the San Jose Sharks. But for the fourth line that features Barclay Goodrow and Ryan Reeves, that's actually not all that bad of a thing. This is a relatively positive outcome for the San Jose Sharks, and so no complaints on my end there. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, they continue to cycle through a bunch of different players. Like I mentioned earlier on, 9 defensemen up here in the NHL. Just a situation that cannot possibly continue. It was already bad as 8. It is now even worse as 9. Something absolutely needs to give, and I feel as though, and I have said this before, so who knows, maybe I'm just completely off base here, but it feels as though something is going to happen very, very soon. The Sharks have just tried out Iorio yesterday. They just tried out Nick Leddy today. It feels as though the decision is coming down between those two players, and I think that the decision is relatively obvious, though I'll get to that a little bit later. Now, with the cycling out, we saw that Desharnais remained on the sidelines. We saw Iorio came out of the lineup, which was no surprise, but we also did see that Sam Dickinson got pulled out as well. Now, this maybe shouldn't come as that much of a surprise because this is the second half of a back-to-back, but at some point, he needs to play a back-to-back. It has not yet happened here, despite the fact that we are in late November, over a quarter of the way into the season, so it was pretty disappointing to see. However, I have already mentioned many times in many past reviews my thoughts on Sam Dickinson actually playing more often, and there's not really much of a point to continue to try and hammer this home. At some point, I just hope that Warsofsky comes to his senses and realizes that Dickinson is a player who can maintain a spot in this lineup over and over again, and that Greer makes the moves necessary to actually make it so that Warsofsky is incentivized with keeping Dickinson in the lineup time and time again. So I'll just end that there. When it comes to the top pairing here tonight of Dmitry Orlov and Timothy Liljegren, you do kind of feel bad for both of these players because obviously Liljegren is very far from being a top pairing defenseman. Like, I think on a good team, he might not even manage to make it into the lineup, or he'd be like a 6th defenseman on like the bottom pairing. And Dmitry Orlov, like, he's okay, but even as recently as last season with the Carolina Hurricanes, he didn't play a significant role for them. And so the Sharks are again playing him very far above his pay grade. Now, they have done a decent job at times this season. In particular, Dmitry Orlov has had some really strong moments. Tonight, however, was not one of them. I thought both Liljegren and especially Dmitry Orlov did struggle at multiple different moments in this game. For instance, on the first Tomas Hertl goal, Orlov gets himself out of position. Timothy Liljegren is in no man's land for whatever reason, and that ends up leading to that Tomas Hertl goal. There were a lot of moments here for Timothy Liljegren where it just felt as though he was completely lost, and this is kind of the coin flip type of defenseman that Timothy Liljegren has been throughout this entire season. There are games where he looks completely locked in. There are shifts where it looks like he is completely engaged. And then there are others where he's just kind of standing around, can't really find his man, doesn't look like he knows what he's doing, doesn't look like he's ever played defense at the NHL level, and is just kind of an unplayable player for the San Jose Sharks. And this is actually the reason for why, after yesterday's game against the Canucks, where he again wasn't very good, that I thought he wouldn't even be in the lineup here tonight. But the Sharks are kind of in an awkward spot where if they were to replace Liljegren here, who ends up taking this spot on the top pairing? It could be Mukhamadullin, but we have seen Mukhamadullin and Orlov together before, and it has not worked out very well. You don't want to put Desharnais in this situation. You don't want to put Klingberg in this situation. And so perhaps he stays here just because Warsofsky feels as though there aren't any other options for this top pairing. And so he's just kind of crossing his fingers and hoping that they're going to end up having a good game and land on a heads instead of having a bad game like they did tonight, landing on a tails. And so I was not impressed with either of these two players. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, I'll actually start off with Mario Ferraro, who I thought was once again probably the Sharks' best defenseman here tonight. He did have a couple of mistakes early on in the third period. Perhaps you can blame that on him trying to really push for some offense as he was playing more so aggressively, which led to some good chances against from the Vegas standpoint. But I thought all in all, across the 60 minutes, Ferraro did some very positive things. And it's interesting right now because you look at, Ferraro with John Klingberg over these last couple of games, things have gone relatively well. You look at him when he was playing with Shakir Mukhamadullin, things were going relatively well. Ferraro right now this season, at least over the past few weeks, has been the type of guy who you play with whoever with him, and that player is able to have a certain amount of success. Ferraro has just been so solid in his own zone that it has actually led to that, and it's kind of crazy to say, because in previous seasons, Ferraro has frequently been the liability on his own defensive pairing, and now he is the strength of it, which is quite nice to see. Now, when it comes to his defensive partner, we of course have John Klingberg, and as per usual, a very interesting player to talk about. Now, when you kind of squint I guess you could say. When you're squinting and you're looking at John Klingberg, you could sort of see the makings of an offensive defenseman. He had some positive moments here tonight, some decent breakout passes, had like a nice little move in the neutral zone to create some chances, a couple of good pinches to keep the puck alive. Like, there are some positives here, and you can sort of see why Warsofsky continues to play him in so many of these offensive situations. By the way, John Klingberg leads all players on the Sharks in ice time in this game, not just ice time, also even strength ice time as well. So because the Sharks are pushing, Warsofsky continuously leans on John Klingberg to be the offensive defenseman to get the Sharks back into this game. The problem is if you actually take a clear look at John Klingberg, you can also see so many errors as well. There was a good 4 or 5 times in this game where Klingberg fails to keep the puck in at the blue line, either because he mishandles it, one time that even led to the Colton Sissons goal that made it 2-1 Vegas, or he's just kind of pressured, doesn't make the play quick enough, and ends up having to take the puck out of the zone. You know, Mark Stone forcing him out a couple of times here in this game, and to be fair, Mark Stone is one of the best defensive players in the entire, one of the best defensive forwards in the entire NHL, and so Klingberg had a little bit of a disadvantage there, but still, when you're being leaned on so significantly, you need that offense to actually flourish more than it has been. You know, it's not as though there are a ton of better options for the San Jose Sharks. You're not necessarily looking at a guy like Ferraro or Nick Leddy or Timothy Liljegren to make these plays, but the fact is that Warsofsky seems to look at John Klingberg as like the next Erik Karlsson, and he is very, very far from that, and it feels as though he probably shouldn't be given this significant amount of ice time because he is not someone who is managing to make these key offensive plays in these key offensive moments, and perhaps the Sharks should look elsewhere, perhaps a defenseman who happens to be sitting on the bench currently for this game and did end up playing yesterday. Not going to name any names, but there is potentially a very interesting candidate who could take that spot, considering John Klingberg has shown time and time again this season that he cannot do this on any sort of consistent basis. And so this was not a terrible game from John Klingberg. I do think that that is important to mention. Defensively, he did have a couple of errors, and obviously there was the mistake that led to the Sissons goal, but I do think that there was some positives here where I still thought he was okay, but obviously there were some major issues as well, and I'm sure you could look at this and be pretty upset. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing here, we have Shakir Mukhamadullin and Nick Leddy. And I'll say this, and I'm not trying to be mean or rude or anything like that, but I do feel as though this should have been the last game that we will ever see of Nick Leddy in a San Jose Sharks jersey. I think we're kind of at the end of our rope here. I mentioned 9 defensemen. Someone needs to go. Iorio, it's not as though he's been all that much better, obviously, but he is younger, and so there's some more potential. Plus, he's a right-shot defenseman, which is more useful for the San Jose Sharks at this point. Nick Leddy, there's just not really anything exciting here whatsoever, at least when it comes to Klingberg. Yes, he's had some really awful outings, but he has the ability to be pretty good. We saw yesterday against the Vancouver Canucks, he put up a solid game. There was like a couple of others earlier on, like against the Winnipeg Jets. Nick Leddy, his best game this season is like average. He's like a 5-on-10 defenseman at best, and more often than not, as was the case here tonight, he's like a 3-on-10. He's just not very useful whatsoever for the San Jose Sharks, and so a decision has to come, and it should be Nick Leddy, and you feel kind of bad, of course, because he gets picked up of waivers from the St. Louis Blues. He didn't want to come here to San Jose, but he has been given a chance. He played the first few games of the season for the Sharks. Those were all games pretty much that the Sharks lost, and so he has been doing nothing to really help the Sharks get victories this season. When he's on the ice, you're always worried about a mistake being made. He's not a clean player whatsoever, not from like he makes dirty plays, but he's just not really kind of like a trusted clean passes or anything of that nature. You're always holding your breath when Nick Leddy is on the ice, and he's just not a trustworthy player at this point. And it's one thing if you're a not trustworthy player as a 19-year-old because there's room for growth and there's a higher ceiling there. But when you're a 34-year-old, that should be the nail in the coffin. That should be what gets rid of you. And so I would be, at this point, pretty disappointed if he ends up playing even one other game for the San Jose Sharks this season. He should be put on waivers. And if he's upset about that, then he can agree to terminate his contract because nobody's picking up a $4 million Nick Leddy at this point, and then he can try to sign league minimum for a different team, because otherwise, report to the Barracuda and play with them and be a decent veteran presence there, because he does not belong in the NHL, or at least not with the San Jose Sharks anymore. When it comes to his defensive partner, Shakir Mukhamadullin, I have talked about recently in his past few games that Mukhamadullin has been coming about and making these major mistakes that end up in the back of the San Jose Sharks net, but like 90% of the rest of the game, he has been mostly solid. And that was kind of the case here once again tonight. You know, there were a lot of really solid, perfectly fine shifts from Shakir Mukhamadullin, but also 2 or 3 moments here tonight where he just makes huge errors on this Mitch Marner goal. Now, it was obviously like a ton of mistakes being made from multiple different Sharks players. Nick Leddy does a terrible step up in the neutral zone. Alex Nedeljkovic plays this one very poorly. I mentioned earlier Kurashev not doing a good enough job coming back, but this is also just a very poor read from Mukhamadullin. He thinks Marner's going to try to make a move to the middle. Marner instead goes wide on him, and so Mukhamadullin is now behind a step and can't really make much of a play on him, either, you know, body physically wise or even stick check wise, and that gives Marner the opening to go for this wraparound type of play. So it was not covered very well by Mukhamadullin. Another point later on where he grabs a puck, puts it down for himself, is unable to settle it quickly enough, and then a Vegas player pokes it past him and gets a good chance going the other way. And so there were definitely some hiccups in Shakir Mukhamadullin game, and these things, they have to clean up. Like, it's one thing to say, okay, well, if you look past the major mistakes, he still played perfectly fine, but those major mistakes can be the difference between a win and a loss, as was the case here tonight, losing this game by 1 goal. If that Mitch Marner goal doesn't go in, perhaps we're having a different conversation here right now. And so at a point, Mukhamadullin needs to clean this one up. Now, of course, unlike with a guy like Nick Leddy, I'm willing to give more rope to Shakir Mukhamadullin because he is a young defenseman and there is that room for, you know, growth up to a certain ceiling, but he does need to improve sooner rather than later. And then finally, we come to the Sharks goaltender, Alex Nedeljkovic. This was the type of game that we saw from the San Jose Sharks. What happens when your goaltender just doesn't steal you a night? Like, it's not as though Nedeljkovic was absolutely awful in this game. Was there a goal that he probably could have had back? Yeah, he definitely could have played the Mitch Marner one a little bit better for sure. The Sissons goal, while this is a pretty significant odd man rush going the other way, it's one that does sneak through him a little bit. The Hurdle goal, the first one, I don't really blame him on because this was just terrible defensive coverage for the Sharks. And then the last Hurdle goal as well was a good tip in front with penalty killers all just kind of standing still and not doing much of anything. But Nedeljkovic, that extra save could have made the difference, but he ended up just kind of playing a generally average performance, and average for this San Jose Sharks team is just not quite enough. They need better than that. But that would do it for this review. The San Jose Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they'll be taking on the Utah Mammoth, the third and final matchup between those teams this season. The first time, the Sharks kind of got crushed a little bit. The second time, however, was rather recent, and the Sharks had picked up an overtime victory, and we'll see what happens in that game, all-deciding Game 3 in this season series. Class dismissed.